Chris and Lena for organizing today. Great talks. So can forest structure buffer biodiversity against the effects of climate change? When I was a kid, my dad would often say, everyone complains about the weather, but no one does anything about it. Through the wonders of Google, I now know that that was actually not his quote. It was a contemporary of Mark Twain's. But it's somewhat the motivator for why I got into some of this work on the interactions between climate and land cover change. Climate change, we hear a tremendous amount about, but it's difficult for a manager because there's not necessarily very much we can do about it, aside from signing a piece of paper every 5 years and maybe spending a lot on flights to get to Paris. So the point is, if we can do something to do with our forests that can actually buffer wildlife from the effects of climate change, this would be quite a good thing. I'm including some nice photos of animals for Alba and Catalina. But they do have a point. The point is that there was a large synthesis paper not so long ago published in Nature that indicated that species globally are showing often negative effects of climate change. They're shifting their ranges northwards, they're shifting up mountains, and populations are certainly declining. More disturbing was a modeling exercise by Chris Thomas and others that showed projecting into the future that species worldwide were going to be at increasing risk as a function of climate change. So they estimated that between 13 and 36% of species would be committed to extinction. Now, to come up with those estimates, they did something called climate envelope modeling. So they built these distribution models based on current climate. They ran forward in time under expectations for what the climate will do, and then they looked at what those distributions and population abundances should be. So this is what a climate envelope model looks like. You can see in one time the distribution of a species on the left, and then we run forward a global circulation model and come up with a prediction for what the distribution of the species should be on the right. So this forms the basis for a lot of our expectations about what biodiversity should do under climate change. So we did an interesting test where we took data on the distribution of species from the 80s. We ran forward what we knew had actually happened to climate into 2010 to see how well those models actually performed. And the answer was quite disturbing. The answer is for most species, they didn't perform that well. We'd see a correlation between what we predicted and what we observed, sometimes significant, but not always the case. So why would this be? Why are we seeing this disjunct between what we think species should be doing on the face of the planet and what they're actually doing? So I'll pose the opposite question to Franco and ask, why are we so often wrong? So this is one of the answers, I think, to the problem. This is one of the climate stations at the H.J. Andrews. And this is the way most climate data are collected worldwide. And so what's the potential problem, do you think, here in terms of understanding species distributions? What's that? You know, not so many of the species that I study live in pastures. That's exactly the point. And so a lot of our estimates for what will happen to global climate are based on data like this. The other issue that's frustrating for me as a landscape ecologist is that often the resolution of our predictions are quite poor. So as we think forward in time, we're talking about degree squares, and we're certainly doing a better job of downscaling. But rarely are we handling the spatial scales that are actually perceived by cute little feathery creatures like this, Alba. So this is a black-throated gray warbler, and we know that it doesn't live in pastures. It lives often under the canopy. Even at a fine scale, it can move in toward a tree trunk or away from a tree trunk to potentially buffer itself from the effects of a warming climate. And of course, we know that forests cover 30% of the planet, but they're actually responsible for the vast majority of terrestrial biodiversity. And so most species are actually on land are perceiving the world a lot more like this than they are in our climate stations. So this raises the question then, do land cover, how we treat the land, and climate interact to drive the abundances of these species that live in the understory? So I have to admit, I feel a bit sheepish standing up here talking about long-term stories. Started with Mark with his 100-year data set. And then it got worse, I think, with Brian with 800 years. And I realized there's no chance I can possibly compete with that because I've only been collecting data for about 6 or 7. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. We're going to I'm going to present you some data from Sarah Fry's PhD thesis on whether under canopy climate conditions differ from out of canopy climate conditions. We're going to make up some data, and I'm going to project populations into the future using those under canopy climate conditions. And then I'm going to steal some data to actually ask whether over the last 30 years or so we've seen some species be buffered from the effects of climate by forest structure. Okay, so we all know that the Earth is not flat, and mountains in particular are likely to experience huge variation in climate across space. And a lot of this is due to some of Chris Daly's work on this idea that we see microclimate variability due to phenomena like cool air pooling. So Sarah set out to actually try and develop some models for that cold air pooling, as a function of both microtopography, macrotopography, and forest structure. So this was part of a bird study, actually, where we were interested in modeling bird distributions as a function of climate. All the points you can see are places we collected bird data, but also microclimate data. So this is a photo of one of our temperature sensors on the left and the right, and we have a massive number of data loggings from this. But the important point for you to take home from this is that these are all under the canopy, experiencing differences in forest structure. So there are several major hypotheses for what would drive microclimate. One is adiabatic lapse rates, the differences in broad-scale elevation. One is microtopography. And then finally, this question of whether forest structure actually drives microclimate. So, and we had some hypotheses about how different forest structures, simple ones in plantations versus more complex ones in old growth, could affect microclimate. And we're lucky enough to have these excellent data from, this was originally Tom Spee's effort on detailed canopy structure from LTER. So what we did was we applied something called a boosted regression tree. This is a machine learning technique that Facebook might use to advertise the right product to you when you're looking at your Facebook page. But we used it essentially to have all of these variables, macro, microclimate, and forest structure, to predict various temperature metrics across the entire Andrews. So what you're looking at here are spatial predictions of maximum temperature in the warmest month and minimum temperature in the coldest month, just two of the variables, and the effect of all these variables on those. So obviously, the redder, the warmer. So these models performed amazingly well, actually, when cross-validated on independent data, about 80% or 90% prediction success. And one thing that was somewhat surprising was, depending on the variable, or depending on which response variable, elevation, topography, and vegetation could actually have very different influences. So in maximum temperature in the warmest month, vegetation actually exerted quite a strong control on that variable. And minimum temperature, elevation was overwhelmingly the strongest effect. So in the end, what we were able to do then was to predict our variables as a function of forest structure and measure the magnitude of that effect. So on the x-axis here, you can see forest structure gradient ranging from simple stands through to old growth stands. And on the y-axis is maximum temperature in the warmest month. And you can see on the sides the LTER equivalents of both plantation and old growth. So how many people would gamble based on what they know about these stands on the direction of this line? Keep in mind these are mature plantations with closed canopy, and the shade amount was quite similar between the two. How many people are voting for the plantation being cooler? Nobody. Just around neck height. Nobody for plantation. All right. I'm going to cut to the chase because I'm running out of time. So turns out old growth is quite substantially cooler, and if you measure it across the entire gradient of this forest structure, it's about a 2.5 degree cooler effect. So this was interesting because it showed, Sarah found, that even these subtle differences in forest structure can actually have quite strong effects on microclimate. So Sarah did a great job of handling some of the media that erupted on this, And some of the media was quite nice and reasonably accurate. Old-growth forests may provide buffer against rising temperatures. Some of it was a little more disturbing and went beyond what we found. Old-growth forests can help preserve biodiversity in a warming world, even though we didn't measure biodiversity. Woodlands can help protect wildlife from global warming. I think one said that old-growth was a weapon that animals could use against climate change. That's my favorite. But there's a big problem with these titles, and that is, of course, we didn't actually measure animals in this study. We were just measuring the climate. So the next stage then was to look at how climate can interact to influence populations. So this is the made-up data part. What we did was across the whole Andrews, we had these data on bird distributions at 183 sample points. And now using our under canopy climate data, we did a climate envelope model for a suite of species. And so, again, the way a climate envelope model works is you have the distribution of a species, you have climate data, and then you can predict where the species is at a current time. And then we can move it forward in time according to various predictions about global change. And you can see this is kind of the pika example of hermit warbler potentially popping off the top of a mountain. So the question we asked then was whether forest structure, plantation versus old growth, should be able to mediate some of these expected declines in the species. And so we did something quite simple. We just basically imagined the whole Andrews was plantation versus all old growth, and we tested to see on the x-axis the degrees Celsius of warming, the effects on the species. And you should know that this particular scenario is under the assumption that there's just an additive effect of forest structure on temperature. Okay, so that 2.5 degrees stays constant over time. And you can see that there really isn't that much of a benefit. The real benefit of old growth comes in if it actually warms at a slower rate than plantation. So under this scenario, old growth is warming at about half the rate. And this emphasizes the need for us to have long-term data. At the moment, we have correlations in plantations and old growth, but we don't actually know what's going to happen over the next 20 years. So finally, and these are the stolen data, has forest structure buffered actual species from climate change? So this is an amazing data set across the US, more than 4,000 routes that are driven by volunteer birders. And we pulled these data, 63 routes across the Pacific Northwest, and calculated bird abundance and trends. Along all these routes, we have data on old growth versus plantation and variety of forest structures. And the prediction was simple. In routes that have a lot of old growth, we potentially would see a decreased effect of warming on populations of those species. In routes that don't, we should see elevated rates of declines. So these are the spatial data on the left, 30-year temperature change per route from the PRISM data. On the right is an old growth index that comes from a GNN, a spatial model of vegetation. And the model is very simple, that population change should be a function of old growth amount and then temperature change. Okay, so we're modeling species trend as a function of old growth and temperature change. So the first thing to do is to look to see if species are actually declining due to warming climate across the routes. And you can see that for most species, this is warming in June from 1980 to 2010. And you can see for most species, there's actually not a substantial negative effect. In fact, really only two show a significant effect of increasing June temperatures. And for July, it's similar. There are 3 species that are showing effects of July temperatures. So really, we'd only expect these ones potentially to show that moderating effect of old growth. So these interactive models are a little bit difficult to get your head around sometimes. So I'm going to walk you through this plot. On the x-axis is the 30-year change in July maximum temperature. Okay, so if it's on the plus side of the 0 there, that route is warmed on average. On the negative side of the 0, the route's cooled. On the y-axis is the population trend for a species. Okay, so we should be expecting this at least, right? As things warm up, the species declines. But then if we think about the amount of old growth on the route, if there's a true buffering effect, we should be seeing something more like this. Okay, so there's this moderating effect of old growth on population declines. You follow? So this is some of what we found for a few species. Hermit warbler, you can see there's a strong negative effect of global or of local July temperature increase on the species. But in roots that had a high proportion of old growth, we're seeing a much more flattened line. Same thing for another species, Wilson's warbler. Strong negative effect on their population trends, but in roots with a high proportion of old growth, we see a much more dampened decline. So this is really, and these are preliminary data, of course, and they're correlations, but quite exciting that we see this potential buffering effect on actual long-term population trends of birds. So before you start feeling really good about that, I'll point out that this was certainly not the case for all species. So this one, for reasons we're failing to come up with a nice post-hoc explanation for, is not showing that buffering effect of old growth. Whether it's an old growth or not, it's still showing quite severe population declines that are related to warming in the roots. So overall then, it seems to be a preliminary good news story in terms of us being able to alter forest structure, alter the local environment experienced by species, and then therefore potentially their population trends. So the conclusions then, old growth matters. It affects microclimate. But the big question that we need from our long-term data to answer is, does it over the long term, and does it actually warm more slowly than non-old growth? Secondly, we now have predictions, quantitative predictions, that we should see some interaction between climate and forest structure on populations. And then finally, we have empirical evidence. As far as I know, the first empirical evidence that forest structure does buffer some species from declines. So I'll close with this maybe provocative note that who would have thought that this species, that arguably was one of the big motivations for the Northwest Forest Plan and subsequently old growth conservation, would turn out to be the protection of that forest is turning out to actually dampen an unforeseen stressor on populations of some of these bird species. So with that, I'll finish and especially thank Sarah for all of her amazing work on this topic through a dissertation, but also co-authors Adam Hadley, Sherry Johnson, Mark Schultz, Julia Jones, and Judy Lee, and of course all the field assistants that have helped us with the work. Thanks.